The goal should be to divide the Middle East, to redraw the borders according to national and religious boundaries.
This is exactly what Woodrow Wilson said in 1918.
But they didn't do that.
They couldn't.
Because the French and the British wanted multinational states where they could more easily rule.
And there would be no opposition, you think, today to this proposal from great powers that saw their interests being in some way damaged by it?
He gave me unlimited power in the question.
The Tikva Fund and Mosaic Magazine present Nationalism and the Future of Western Freedom, a lecture based on the Mosaic article of the same title by Yoram Hazony. My name is Jonathan Silver, and in this episode I will moderate a conversation between Yoram Hazony and Walter Russell Mead, in which we probe the themes that came to light in their earlier remarks.
Yoram, just listening carefully to Walter's presentation, Walter, you'll tell me if I'm understanding correctly, but the main current that Walter would have us remember when we're trying to understand the limitations of the nation are that nations historically just don't deal with minorities well. If there's a virtue to the nation, which is that citizens have an affection for one another, shared memories, the organic growth of the Burkean nation that Walter was having us remember, it does that very well. But for people who don't fit into that, the nation has not been a good political form for them. Well, is that true?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Walter. I mean, I don't see his questions as complications. I mean, I think his elegant presentation presses on all the right points, and I think basically everything that he said is correct. And the question is, but what if we need to make a decision? And that's sort of I think where we actually are. I don't think that an imperialist or internationalist principle can live in the same political environment with a principle of diversity and self-determination. I think you have to make a decision, just like you can say monarchy has advantages over republicanism. Democracy has many, many flaws. We all understand this. I think we all know that democracy has flaws, but we make a choice. We say one is better than the other. And that's what we have to do. We have to make a choice. And that despite the fact that almost everything that Walter said is just correct. Now, to your question, no, it's not true. I think what is true, and what Walter highlights, I think, very well, is that human beings do not deal with minorities well. So if human beings are running a national state, they don't deal with minorities well. And if human beings are running an imperial state, they don't deal with minorities well. I mean, this is unfortunately a universal problem. But all we need to do is look at, did Pharaoh deal well with minorities despite his cosmopolitan universal ambition? Did Nebuchadnezzar? Even the Persians were, so vaunted for, their dealing well with minorities, and Cyrus spoke on behalf of our God in calling us to rebuild the temple, and at the same time we read every Purim in the book of Esther about Persians, in classic anti-Semitic form, being completely incapable of digesting the Jews because they're too different. This is a universal problem. So I don't think the issue either of how minorities are dealt with or how the Jews are dealt with, I don't think it cuts in either direction, except, if we're going to talk about the Jews, except for one particular point, which is that an internationalist order based on universal standards determined by judges sitting in European courts, German judges, French, Scandinavian judges, determining what should happen in other nations, that's an order that's going to make the state of Israel illegitimate very, very quickly. So I think in general the issue of minorities is a wash, and I think in general the issue of where are the Jews better is also a wash, because the Dutch nationalists created the best place in Europe for Jews to be. The American nationalists created a very good place for Jews to be. So I think that's a wash. But if you want to really know where the rubber hits the road, it's on the State of Israel. Look to see who really is out there seeking to take actions to boycott, to defest, to delegitimize, to destroy. And you'll see that it's the internationalists who are doing it. You're right, there's plenty of petty anti-Semites. Unfortunately, there always were and there always will be. But where should the Jews today be positioned? I think it's absolutely clear. And just one thing about those Trump supporters. As far as I understand, the case is that the Republican Party is today pretty significantly further in the direction of support for Israel than the Democratic Party. I wish it weren't so. That's not my preference. But I think that all the studies indicate that. And my math is not incredibly strong, but I think that at the moment, the great majority of Republicans are in fact saying that they're going to vote for Trump. So it's extremely unlikely that most of the Trumps are this kind of anti-Semitic wave, the Trump supporters. Whether Trump is a good guy or bad guy is a different issue. But I think tying that to anti-Semitism, I think, is a mistake.
Walter, if it's the case that the problems with minorities is a function of human nature and not the political order, to your mind, does that suggest actually the opposite, that we should just eliminate the problem of minorities? There should be many, many homogeneous states with no minorities.
One thing I would say is that, we're talking about political abstractions. What's interesting is that nationalism actually worked very differently in Western Europe than it did in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Ottoman Empire. So, nationalism, after a bit of sorting out and so on, led to a great deal of stability in Britain, in France, to some degree. The Catalans might disagree, in Spain, Italy. That national movements solved political problems in much of Europe. But in other parts of Europe, and certainly to this day in the former Ottoman Empire, national movements created as many problems as they solved. And you think about, say, the history of again, with the Ottoman Empire, where you have think hypothetically, suppose the different language groups and economic groups in India began to experience, Dravidian nationalism and so on. India might well find itself torn apart for 50 or 100 years of mass slaughter and genocide among people who had spent many years living peacefully side by side, just as happened in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, just as happened in Yugoslavia after Tito. So I think it's it oversimplifies things to try to to put too much weight on these abstract political categories and say that this leads to that as some general rule. You have to look at the situation, and so that Kurdish nationalism, probably a good thing in a way, but there are a lot of places that Kurds think are part of Kurdistan and other people don't think are part of Kurdistan, and probably the only way that'll be settled until all the non-Kurds in future Kurdistan are either killed or driven away, and all the Kurds out of Kurdistan, or most of them, are killed or driven away, because that's the truth. Who was it who in the Devil's Dictionary says that canon, noun, an instrument used in the rectification of national boundaries. If we think about, okay, now we're going to divide Syria between, or look what's happened in South Sudan. Look what's happening between the Hutus and the Tutsis. I'd actually say the murderous course of nationalism in our world is by no means over, and that probably millions more people are going to die as the sort of political boundaries are sorted out. So, on the other hand, I don't actually think that forms of nationalism and cosmopolitanism are entirely distinct in this way. I look at someone like Teddy Roosevelt in the United States, who was about as nationalist as it's possible for an American to be, and yet, believed in the construction of a liberal order, but a less sort of totalitarianly liberal order than Wilson. So Teddy Roosevelt rejected the League of Nations as an idea. It was too top-down and so on, but believed that American interests couldn't be achieved in a world in which there weren't sets of liberal institutions. So it seems to me there is some kind of trade-off between an unelected judge in The Hague being able to do absolutely anything he or she might take into their head to do, and an anarchy composed of states built on national principles. And it also seems to me that say, in the United States, where to a very large degree, if not a total degree, we have separated tribe and state as much as we've separated church and state. And believe me, that is an important victory. One, without which we would all be a lot less happy than we are. We can, in fact, have a nationalism which is pluralist in some ways, not without tension. Not without tension. And I would say that the white ethno-nationalism that you see animating parts of the Trump movement is a threat to that. Now, I think these people have been aggressed upon in the sense that right now, if you want to do African-American identity politics, well, that's liberal and progressive. If you want to do Hispanic identity politics, that's liberal and progressive. If you think that women should have women's only spaces and that women should help each other, mentor each other in their careers and kind of push against men, that's progressive. But if white people decide they want safe spaces, if white men decide that white men should get together and mentor young white men and help them along, this is evil. So some kinds of identity politics have been deemed progressive and cosmopolitan, and other kinds of identity politics are deemed reactionary and vicious. In fact, I would argue that all of these forms of identity politics I'm talking about share some characteristics of being good and positive and also being negative and dangerous, just as all forms of nationalism do. So it's complicated, but I would say that if the kind of ethno-nationalism that has animated the Trump movement becomes the dominant form of American nationalism, I think Israel's population is likely to grow.
Will you be joining us, Walter?
Well, I'm actually, I'm supposed to make a speaking tour in the UK 2 days after the election, so I'm practicing my, appeal for political asylum in my opening speech, and I'm not sure I might need it no matter which candidate wins.
One of the questions Walter raises in that answer is, as you see it, is there anything in the biblical depiction of the nation, the biblical articulation of the nation, or the Protestant construction that gave that articulation life in Europe, that would offer something to those concerned about the excesses, the violent excesses of nationalism?
I think there's a few things. I mean, the first thing is, and here I'll take a page from Walter, I'm beginning to practice my fuddy-duddy complicating tendencies. Good. Eventually I'll need them since it'll be my role.
You'll get there.
I'm working on, and you'll help me. You'll help me.
Partner.
You'll help me. So one complication is that people. people often use this expression ethno-nationalism, and it is a technical term that academics use, but it also sort of has broader implications. And I don't mean that Walter means this, but it may be that the people listening might interpret it this way. When people say ethno-nationalism, there's a completely legitimate concern of what happens if the independent nation is intolerant to one or another group. Now your eye always quickly goes to those groups that with which there is some kind of conflict. I mean, as Walter correctly says, if sort of the evil impulse of empire is to go out and conquer and oppress and unify and homogenize, then the evil impulse of independent nation is this irredentism that says, well, we once owned that, and there's a few of our tribesmen over there, and there's a few of our kinsmen over there, and there's always good excuses to go to war if you're so inclined. But actually, historically, nationalism often is a unifying factor. And if we take, Walter brought up the case of British nationalism, which in fact is a unification of 4 different peoples. And these 4 different peoples at different times were independent, and maybe someday they'll be independent again. But if you look at Shakespeare's Henry V, for example, at the depiction of the dialogue among the Welshmen and the Irishmen, and the national call is for everyone to unite and overcome their differences in order to join in the common struggle. Now, in Israel, we're very familiar with this. We have, for example, the Druze people is a non-Muslim people in Israel who serve in the Israeli army. The Muslims don't, but the Druze do. They serve in the Israeli army. It was a decision that was made by their leadership at the time of the War of Independence. It was a Jewish War of Independence. Jews were fighting for independence, but the Druze joined them. This is a non-Jewish people that said, we're going to join you in your national effort. Now, the love that the bond of love, and I don't use that word love lightly. Some people use it freely. I use it rarely. The bond of love that exists between Jews, the gratitude towards Druze for their military service and for their participation in the establishment of the Jewish national state is extremely powerful. It's an extremely powerful thing. I think you can actually find examples of this in almost every nation state. Right? That is, there's an interest when you're struggling to reach out for allies. And very often the reaching out for allies is something that overcomes bigotry and personal animosity. I'm not saying it always does, but sometimes it does. That's one important thing to consider. And the other important thing to consider that you were asking about biblical safeguards is that the Jewish nation in the Bible, as far as we know, is the first nation in history. I mean, maybe we'll dig up something else, but as far as we know, it's the first nation in history whose God gives it borders and says, you're not going to touch the land of your neighbors because God gave those lands to somebody else. Right? I mean, there is something intrinsic in nationalism which allows you to say, I don't have any interest I just don't have any interest in conquering the world. I'd like to be able to draw some appropriate borders. My last point on this. In the Middle East today, there's really one nation that, thank God, at the moment is rock solid, and it's the State of Israel. And the State of Israel is rock solid because of its relative homogeneity. it's a country that, because of the fact that the great majority of its citizens are Jews, it makes it possible for there to be an extremely high degree of cohesion. There isn't really any risk. There really isn't any risk of civil war, for example, in Israel. Take a look at any of our neighbors. What's going on? What's going on in Syria? What's going on in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and what could easily happen in other countries, like Iran or Saudi Arabia? It could easily happen. None of these are ethnically homogenous countries. They're all held together by oppression. The borders that divide these countries, these borders are completely artificial. They don't create, they don't attempt to create ethnically homogenous people. Just the opposite. Syria was purposely constructed. The Alawites begged the French to allow them to have an independent national state. In the 1930s, they begged them, don't put us in a country, don't put us in the same country with the Sunni Muslims. There's going to be, they'll massacre us. There's going to be wars for generations. And the French refused. They insisted to put the Kurds and the Alawites and all these other groups, the Druze, they put them in a single country. And the only way that that country was held together as though there was such a thing as Syria was through oppression. If there'd been an Alawite independent country like the Jewish independent country, it's entirely possible. The Alawites were Western looking. It's entirely possible it could have been a liberal democracy today.
I guess this is my last question, a question for both of you. Yoram, the international order that you described its different parts of before, the United Nations, the ICC, international law, the European Union, these were all advanced to solve very particular problems. And some of those problems, these institutions may have in fact succeeded in solving, temporarily solving. If we were to see a resurgence of nations, how would we solve them again? The same problems arise.
Well, some of those problems need to be solved, and some of those problems don't need to be solved. I mean, we'd have to talk about each issue, but I think fundamentally, unilateral, voluntary participation in negotiated agreements among nations can create international institutions. There's nothing wrong with it. Just the opposite. It's desirable. It's desirable that instead of going to war every time we have a trade disagreement, it's desirable that we should negotiate. Then there should be mechanisms for resolving problems, and those mechanisms can include international bodies that will make decisions on specific issues. That's not the question. The question is the desire to move to a circumstance in which a nation will be considered illegitimate if it doesn't sign the Kyoto Protocol, if it decides that unilaterally that it's going to, for self-defense, it's going to impose a blockade on Gaza, if it decides that the common law is simply the law of the land and it just doesn't make any difference what people in Europe think, right? If nations make decisions, let's say that there's a country that decides that decides to close stores on Sunday. I'd prefer that they would adopt the biblical Sabbath, but let's say they decided to close stores on Sunday. What kind of a principle is it that some court in some other country should be determining whether that violates human rights or not? It makes no sense. So I say let's look for international fraternity through voluntary agreements among nations, and let's drop the whole pretense of attempting to create some kind of a universal Roman law that somebody's going to impose on everybody for all of our good.
So Walter, just to continue Yoram's specifics. Look, wars are now fought really paying little attention to borders. Cybersecurity and hacking, technology has made it such that there are some crimes that are so monstrous against humanity that overcome all national borders, and we need international institutions to adjudicate them, to prosecute them, to bring those responsible for justice. there were specific reasons that were elaborated for these international institutions. And can the fraternity of nations, is that adequate to that task?
Well, I would say within nations, we've had courts for a very long time and haven't eliminated crime. So I'm not sure that a legal system is going to, stop crime. I mean, I think my sense is that there are, I've been fortunate enough to spend time with Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who at one time was the darling of the liberal internationalists because he, ended a genocide and so on. And today he's disliked by many of the same people because, and in my mind, Kagame has always basically operated on the principle that my people are about 10% of the combined 15% of the population in our basin, and there are people in this other group that want to kill us all. And my job is to keep my people alive. And I think in Rwanda the best way to do this is basically to lie to everyone and say that tribal politics are not what it's about. Meanwhile, I am trying to develop the country as rapidly as I can, but I am going to keep an armed force that is strong enough to make sure this never happens again. And if keeping that armed force funded means I have to be involved with blood minerals in the Congo and various forms of military operation there that fight my enemies while keeping my state and my military funded, I'll do it. Now it seems to me that Kagame has done some things that would be considered war crimes in any international court, in a sense worthy of the name, but at the same time he's done other things that were clearly in the self-interest of his people, and his motivations throughout have been consistent. Is there a form of international law or a possibility for international law? In some ways, this was the problem, I think, that in 1947-48, the Jews and Arabs faced in Palestine, that despite episodes of tension and so on, so long as there had been a British authority or some kind of authority that kept the struggle between the peoples within some kind of bounds, it was tension, there were bad moments and so on, but when that authority withdrew and nothing else came in to take its place, both peoples found themselves in a sort of law of the jungle situation, where people were acting as they understood it, as Paul Kagame does, in defense of the existence of his people. Now, how do you apply a legal framework to actions taken in a state of nature, so to speak? And that's often the case, in a sense, with the place where international institutions have the hardest time functioning effectively is where people are having to take action where the rule of law isn't really established. So, if I'm in a city where there is law and so on, and I break the law, prosecute me. But if I live in a place where violent gangs are running things and there is no government, and I organize to protect my family and I've got guns, I'm not interested in what your judges have to say about my conduct, because the first element of government is protection for the innocent. You haven't provided it. So, again, I think we have to think, if we sort of think as matters of intellectual history and political science principle about international institutions, we get ourselves caught up in sort of Thomistic, or may I say Talmudic, logic here that doesn't necessarily get closer to an answer. We have to look at the circumstances and understand what's going on. It's hard, it's unpleasant, it means that the rules, it's very hard to find rules that are binding in all situations. But yes, we need international institutions. It would be a better world probably with the rule of law, except how would we know that the rule of law itself wouldn't become contrary to moral law? Can't tell you. So I think we're just going to have to go on messing around in the human condition. Do our best, and remember that each country is in different circumstances. Things that we might need to do or be able to do in the United States wouldn't make sense for Denmark, wouldn't make sense for France, wouldn't make sense for Israel, wouldn't make sense for India. Each of these countries, there is a reality there. And systems of law, systems of justice have to be grounded in reality or they're not just. And I think that would be the point that I would try to make, that European courts with European laws, it actually at this point may make perfect sense that they should manage their own affairs in ways that seem to work for them. Maybe they'll work, maybe they won't, but it's their business. But it's to try to regulate Syria or Israel, or for that matter, the DRC, as if it were Belgium or Luxembourg or Sweden, is nonsensical. So I would move on this principle, I think.
Let me tell you why I'm pushing on this issue of the Protestant nature of this construction, of this world that we've lived in for 350 years. I think that there's a false narrative, a false historical narrative, which is widely circulated, which describes the transition from medieval European Christendom to the modern world as a process of secularization. And when people say secularization, that's often a stand-in for what I'm calling liberalism, but let's leave it at secularization for a moment. There's a story that's well known that goes, there was medieval darkness followed by enlightenment. And you've all heard many different more educated or less educated, more accurate or less accurate versions of this story. It's almost a standard story. And the story's almost completely false in the sense that the political theorists and economists and scientists and theologians who created the world that we live in were almost entirely Bible-fearing Protestants, more orthodox, less orthodox. You can argue about each one, but at least the extent to which I'm calling them Protestant, which in this essay, what I propose is that it's a little bit of a simplification, as Walter will correctly point out, but I propose a simplification to understand this. I say, what is it, in fact, that in the 1500s and the 1600s, what was it that was taken from the Old Testament that was then used in order to create the political order that's familiar to us? And I propose two things. One is the principle of the freedom of nations, national self-determination. That name comes later, of course. And the other is Calvin is Luther and Calvin proposed that the Ten Commandments should be regarded as a natural law, which will of course be interpreted differently by different nations. But they did propose this as kind of a moral minimum. If you're not protecting life, property, family, that the courts are doing justice, the Sabbath, public recognition of God, if you're not doing these minimum things, then you're not running legitimate government. You're running some kind of a tyranny. Okay, so there is such a Protestant model, and we see that when we look at the creation of modern states, when we look at the creation of the modern Netherlands or England. That's what we see. Now, I have a problem with a story that doesn't recognize that when countries, later independent nations are founded, Protestant ones, also Catholic nations, a Jewish nation, the state of Israel. If we don't recognize as a matter of political and intellectual history that these nations are building on that Protestant model, and that they work because of the fact that they take these two principles, and there's a tension between the principle of self-determination and this moral minimum. The moral minimum is capable of undermining and making conditional government. That's a fruitful and important development. If we don't understand that our world is built on that, then we get confused, and then somebody comes and says to us, well, what makes political legitimacy? It's individual liberty. The moment somebody says, look, to us today, when somebody says individual liberty is what makes for political legitimacy, it just automatically sounds normal because our elites don't talk about anything else. But it's historically false. In fact, the nation-state system, the national state system, was not built on that principle. It wasn't the founding principle. It's a later development of that system. And what I want to make sure is that we don't take a principle that in fact is founding a completely new order, which has not existed anywhere and is totally untested. And to the degree that it is tested, it's beginning to look kind of ugly. I don't want to confuse the two. They're two different things. And when Roosevelt and Churchill met in 1941 and signed the Atlantic Charter, right, this is before the United States entered World War II, but Churchill and Roosevelt, they met in order to discuss what their joint platform would be. And this paper called the Atlantic Charter reaffirms that that the Western powers fighting the Nazis, that the issue is that each nation should be able to determine its own government. In other words, they reaffirm this Protestant biblical principle as the foundation of what the war they're fighting for is about. The Nazis, they're imperialists. They're not willing to let anybody. They're completely against the idea of the national state. The Soviets, they're completely against the idea of the national state. But we, the Western powers, what do we stand for? We stand for that. And their radio broadcasts, their propaganda to Europe was based on that. We're coming to free you. Fight for us because we'll give you national self-determination. That's what they broadcast. They actually betrayed that principle because later they turned around and supported the unification of Europe, both the Americans and the British, for reasons because they thought it would help them fight the Soviets and keep the Germans down and all sorts of other brilliant ideas. I want to keep it clear. The problem is we don't have clarity. I want clarity. These Protestant principles were completely clear in the discussions between Churchill and Roosevelt during the war, and the Allies understood them. It's just we today that don't understand where our freedoms came from.
Walter, you want to respond to that also?
I remember reading this part of the essay, and I did think you were being a little too kind, particularly to Winston Churchill, on the question of self-determination. Churchill was absolutely crystal clear he was fighting the war to defend the British Empire. And Churchill was willing to go along with what he thought was Roosevelt's just because of the importance of trying to bring the United States in. He was lying through his teeth. He didn't mean a word of it. And so, and I do think it's very important we not confuse the statements that people make in order to achieve specific political gains with their profound inner views, and I think that was a case where I would have been more cautious. But also, just on the, I can't find a sequencing in the sense that, you know, where do our modern law ideas of international law come from? A lot of them actually come from people, the work of jurists in places like the Netherlands in the 17th century. And, you know, that's basically where a lot of modern international law traces its roots. I'm also not quite sure how the French Revolution fits in with a Protestant construction of Europe. It actually was the Jacobin state was anti-religious, and I mean one still sees that today. The French do not believe, for example, that individual liberty is the key to everything. Otherwise, the burkini would be more celebrated than it is. It's a different view. Yeah. So, you know, I actually think it's very, very hard to write essays. I mean, you actually do a very good job, but it's very hard to write these sort of trying to turn political history into intellectual history. It's one of the most difficult tasks there is. I'm not even sure it can be done, but we keep trying. I keep trying.
I'm calling liberalism a specific thing. I understand that the word liberalism has been used by many people for many different things. Among other things, it's used by people who are the radical left, who really are, very close to being Marxists. And it's also used by all sorts of conservatives who think that they're liberals. I mean, just about everybody wants to be a liberal today. I don't. So there's one, maybe a small group of us. But I want to be clear more than anything else, more than even than wanting to be right. I would like to be clear. I would like us to be able to think clearly. So I proposed a tool for helping us think clearly about this. And I suggested that the main phenomenon that has been called liberalism, and that I'm today calling liberalism, is people for whom political things, political matters, can reasonably be reduced to an extremely simplistic, extremely reductive model, which, in my opinion, Locke should never have proposed and should never put to paper because it's so shockingly reductive and simplistic, which reduces the complexity of what it means to be human and to create human societies and to live in political societies, reduces it to creatures that are A, perfectly free at birth, as he says, B, perfectly equal, and C, generate moral obligation and ties of legitimacy through consent and not through any other way. And I just will do this briefly, but an example, a counterexample that I gave against this view is my brother or my sister. I'm born into the same family. Do I have any special obligations to them or not? According to Locke's model, it's so reductivist that the answer is no. His model doesn't generate any kind of moral obligations between brothers. And by the way, I had breakfast, just in case you think what I'm saying is just completely, on the moon. I had breakfast with a libertarian friend just a few months ago. And I pushed him on this point. And I said, really, it's all about consent? There are no other obligations? What about your family? What about your brothers? Do you have any brothers? And he actually, here's what he says. He says, my brothers? No, I don't feel any particular obligation to him. Well, why should I? All right, now, that's an extreme case. Okay, it's an extreme case.
You should meet his brother.
But I do want us to think about this. We said, everybody in college, many kids in high school, we did this in high school. You start to study politics and they trot out Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes, and it's as though that's political. Now, seriously? I think this is immensely destructive. I think it's unbelievably destructive. I think you simply can't think straight about the political world if you think that the political world is as described by the argument between Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. There's a whole world of people who think that's reasonable. I think we got to stop it. I'm calling that liberalism. If you want to pick another name, please feel free.
I shouldn't be the king of Babel. I wouldn't know. I mean, I don't, what is it? I don't have the wisdom to judge this great people. I think Solomon said. That's where I concur with Solomon. Unlike him, I haven't been given it. So I actually would say I don't see an answer to the human condition. And I would say that some of those nations might need to be governed in some ways. Some of those nations might need to be governed in other ways. And the relationships between those nations would depend. But there's a very, we've been talking mostly at the level of ideas. And I think we have to actually, talk about other things that affect politics. One of them being that if you think about the post-World War II era, by and large, most of the larger nation states and even some of the smaller ones were more or less economically self-contained. So that, in the United States we had the one telephone company, the 3 car companies, the 7 sister oil companies, and actually foreign trade in the 1950s was a lower percentage of our GDP than it had been in the 1790s, or even at virtually any other point. And so the nation state, if you were a larger nation, was more or less sort of coterminous with your economic organization. That wasn't as true in Europe, where, say, the Benelux countries or some others, simply the economic processes on which they depended for their food were already multinational. And Europe needed a kind of a multinational economic organization, particularly in the post-war conditions, to survive. America actually needed a very nationalist approach, and we had it. These days, as the world economy has changed and technology has changed, it's simply, you think about the computer in your kid's bedroom, that computer is in international space, in the sense that Russian hackers could be in there, all kinds of international criminals, pornography, that computer is not in the United States in a way that everything in your kid's bedroom would have been in the United States. Nor if you think about pollution and other problems or labor regulation and these kinds of things, there genuinely is a kind of international economy and an information economy which is transnational in a way that very little was transnational 50 years ago. And it's a legitimate governance problem. How does one manage this? And it means that while maybe abstract political principles haven't changed, the answers that we have to give to questions change. I think the Europeans have made a lot of mistakes in the construction of the European Union. And frankly, the last people who should be the most powerful political actors in any multinational state are the Germans. They're just not one of their talents. And that's just the way it is. However, does Europe need some kind of deep organization that is more than national? Well, actually, yes, if they're going to have food on their table and they're going to have clean rivers and things like that, they do. So I would actually, again, this would just redouble down this point that though you would have to consider, as the absolute king of Babel, looking at these people streaming out, you'd have to consider the people, the nature of their economy, the nature of their neighbors, and you wouldn't have one provision, one size fits all government. You couldn't.
We actually, unfortunately, have a real life test case, and it's in Babel. I mean, the Middle East today has decayed into something very similar to the chaotic situation that Fred was describing. And I have a proposal. Let's divide the Middle East to the extent that it's within our power. It's not necessarily within our power, but if we want to know what our policy should be, what's our goal, the goal should be to divide the Middle East, to redraw the borders according to national and religious boundaries. That's the only chance that there is to keep this endless war, to limit it and turn it into border conflagrations instead of an unfolding genocide.
This is exactly what Woodrow Wilson said in 1918.
But they didn't do that.
They couldn't.
Because the French and the British wanted multinational states where they could more easily rule.
And there would be no opposition, you think, today to this proposal from great powers that saw their interests being in some way damaged by it?
He gave me unlimited power in the question. Or he offered it to you.
Yeah, right, he offered it to me.
And I usurped it.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the problem, is that one can think of an abstract answer, but it will never actually work, because the world would have to be dramatically other than it was in order for this thing to happen. Yeah, well, I think the reason I said nationalism wasn't the answer, because maybe it's my misreading of the essay, but I had the sense it was, okay, we have too much cosmopolitanism. What do we need? Nationalism, and that will fix it. And my point was that nothing will fix it. You burn your fingers in both flames. Nationalism, Japanese nationalism is not the same thing as Indian nationalism, is not the same thing as American nationalism, is not the same thing as Canadian nationalism, and it's not the same thing as Israeli nationalism. So I think, sort of the desire, one of the things that I was always taught as a kid, one of the great things about the Hebrew Bible is that it doesn't have any abstract nouns. It's a language, it was a language of concrete nouns and expressions. And that maybe that kept people more grounded. That's at least what the Southern Protestants who gave me my introduction to the Bible told me. For all I know, they were right. So I think, as soon as you say nationalism, you've actually created, I think the technical term would be a graven image. That is to say, you've created something that disguises reality rather than revealing reality. And then you start holding debates on nationalism without fully looking at the different forms and different needs. And, Japanese nationalism is really different even from Korean nationalism or Chinese nationalism. And so when we start saying, is nationalism the answer to a problem? Well, then you get a different problem, because, the problem that one might think about in terms of, say, Northeast Asian regional security and dueling nationalism is quite different from the problems of Europe or the problems of Latin America. So you're asking how a bunch of phenomena that you're all calling nationalism are good at solving problems of international order, which are also extremely different in all these places. You are basically just having a wonderful time blowing clouds of smoke. And it would be fine if you weren't deceiving. If you were just simply passing the time, that's fine, we all need to rest. But you're deceiving yourself. You are under the belief that you're actually talking about real things when you're not. And many of the very grave errors that people make in analysis and statesmanship are exactly when they start acting as if these kinds of mental, these very fragile mental constructions were actually a solid bridge that you can go walk on. This doesn't mean that I reject the concept of abstract thought or ideas, but you have to be very careful. And we have, as human beings, again, we know our own, speaking as an American, I know American politics very well. I'm one of the few Americans who travels a lot and can talk with some knowledge, say, about the French political culture or German or Italian, whatever, though I know I don't understand it as well as I understand my own. Most of us, when we make generalizations about international society or political things, are unconsciously projecting our own national experience, which we know, on the vast screen of international life, which we don't know. So, for example, one of the reasons that in Egypt I hear so many conspiracy thinking is because, frankly, in Egypt, politics is conspiracy theories. That the way you read an Egyptian newspaper is not to find out what information is happening, but to think, okay, who decided to put that article there? And what does that tell me about who's up and down in the hidden political struggles that are never openly talked about? And so people who've grown up and lived in that environment now try to analyze what's happening in another environment that's quite different, but they don't understand. They bring these interpretive tools. This is why Americans are always seeing the triumph of liberal democracy everywhere. We are projecting our experience and our labels onto others. So if there's one thought I could leave people with tonight, it would be very, very careful. Well, actually, maybe I'll put my lesson this way: thou shalt not make or bow down and worship graven images. You know, it's a very dangerous habit.
Please join me in thanking Walter Russell Mead and Yoram Hazony.